Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I'm an avid family historian who's been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with now nearly 20,000 people collectively recorded in my trees. Today I'm going to continue to tell you the story of Elizabeth Craven and mainly her first husband, Alpheaus Barrington, that was a complete surprise to me in my history. If you haven't tuned in to the first part of episode 2, Bigamy, please go back and have a look at the second episode. Really important to get the background information before I delve into today. Recap, you would recall in the last podcast that we finished with Alpheaus returning from his expedition in New Zealand that had mixed reports. In some reports it was saying it was a heroic expedition, and others saying that he was typically a fraud and a shyster. So I'm just about to embark on the events of his life once he did return from New Zealand, and I'll leave you to be the judge. In mid-December 1865, Alpheaus returned from New Zealand. The next I can find about him is in 1866, in a newspaper report where a man named William Cook was being sought by police as they had found the remains of his wife Maria Cook and the young daughter when they were felling trees. And what they suspected was that Maria's husband William was the murderer. And they were really trying to search for some information because William Cook seemed to have disappeared into nowhere. And there was a tiny mention in a newspaper article about how William Cook was part of the Walhalla Brothers American Circus in South Australia in around the 1866 period, and that a man named Barrington was also part of that circus, and he was also known as Montague. So this is the first time that this surname Montague has popped up. But as I go through other information about Alpheaus, you'll realise that this must be a connection to Alpheaus, as he uses this name in some form several times throughout his life. The next time Alpheaus pops up in records is 3 years later, and in August 1869 he left with a prospecting group for New Caledonia. Reports in January 1870 said that Barrington and his group had found gold nuggets. However, M.G. Tully, Barrington's agent, went to the lengths of actually printing in the paper a caution to the public because the claim had not yet been substantiated. So it sounds quite similar to the New Zealand claims. He arrived back in Sydney in January 1871, and there wasn't fanfare and there weren't headlined articles saying that this particular party had found the El Dorado. There was a tiny advert in a newspaper in Sydney for a single man to take charge of a small farm at New Caledonia. So it is possible that Alpheaus may have found some small amounts of gold and possibly gathered enough finances to obtain a small farm in New Caledonia, and also may have had a bit more money behind him to be able to have a man manage that farm for him. Alpheaus went from Sydney to Melbourne in 1872, and by 18th of June 1873, it's discovered that he had a child with a young lady called Sarah Annie Gee. Sarah was 19 at the time. Alpheaus was 41. They had a child, Montague Charles Gee, and here we are with this Montague link. So he's given himself the name Montague back in 1866. By 1973, he has a child and decides to call him Montague. This child was born at Emerald Hill in Melbourne, which is now known as South Melbourne. And this child, unfortunately, died at the age of 7 on the 15th of October 1880. Alpheaus was living with his child. Sarah was not on the scene at the time. And there's a couple of reasons why Sarah may not have been living with them. The first reason is that, remember that Alpheaus is married. So at this point, he can't marry Sarah, so she could have suffered from social disapproval directed at her being the mother of an illegitimate child, and with that shame, maybe an arrangement was made that she simply gave her son to Alpheaus to return to Kingawa. The other theory too is that she married a Melbourne clerk called George Anderson, and she married him in August 1876. So what I'm thinking is that if she had met this George Anderson and within 3 short years, with her son being quite young, she either hid the existence of this son or she said to Alpheus, "You take him," in order for her to marry this man. And she had a child with George Anderson in 1877. So within 12 months of her marrying George, she'd had a child of her own with him. Just a side note too, I mentioned how he had died, Montague Charles Guy, and there was an inquest into his death as he had drowned. And the child's name at the point of the inquest and the death was in fact Alpheaus John Barrington. So it seems to me that once Alpheaus took on full-time care, he decided to change the child's name from Guy to Barrington, so there were no questions asked over at Kingower. So how did this little boy die? Well, only a few months after Barrington returned to Kingower with his son, young Alfie was drowned on the way home from school while playing in the water of a mining dam. A neighbour passing the dam recognised the boy's boots lying on the water's edge, and the wife of the owner of the property in which the dam was located alerted Barrington to the fact that Alfie may have had an accident. With the others, Barrington went to the dam, he stripped off, and he searched in the water, and after about 20 minutes he found Alfie's body in water 2 metres deep. So I'm sure it would have been a shocking event for Alpheus to be searching desperately for his son, and him being the one that actually pulled him out of the dam. Just as a little side note too, with the inquest papers, Alpheus is referred to as Alpheus John. However, with the child's death certificate, he's listed as Alphons John. Again, that variation in his first name, whether it was intentional or not, it's interesting because it seems to have popped up again. His son's death may have prompted a fresh start for Alpheus, because by April 1975, he's recorded as marrying Isabella Powell-Smith in Horsham, Victoria. They married in the Presbyterian Church in Horsham, and on the marriage certificate he states his occupation as a mariner, which is possibly exaggerating the fact that he was likely a crew member on a ship, not necessarily a mariner, and that he came from County Cork in Ireland, where his father was a doctor of medicine and his mother came from the Montague family. And again, he's bringing up Montague as this name. My research, Alpheus's mother was actually Emma Brillen. There's no mention of Montague with her maiden name. He stated his current occupation as a barman at the Horsham Hotel, and within 2 months of their marriage, they had purchased 319 acres of land at Dolan in Victoria. Now, things weren't going so well in the marriage, and this probably wouldn't have helped, because in December 1877, he decided to petition a divorce from my great-great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Craven. And he states that he's proceeding with the divorce now due to not having the financial means prior to this point. However, of course, we do know that he's committed bigamy, because 2 years prior he had already married Isabella. Now, whether Isabella somehow found out about this, and in order to save his marriage, he's gone ahead to petition this divorce. In the records of the divorce, he's known as Alpheaus Barrington, Alphers this time. So again, another variation on his name. I'm now going to read you the divorce records of Barrington versus Barrington and Preston. It says, in the matter of Alpheus John Barrington of Kingower in the colony Victoria, minor, for the dissolution of his marriage with Elizabeth Barrington, formerly Elizabeth Craven. I, Alpheus John Barrington of Kingower in the colony of Victoria, minor, make oath and say that I was married to the respondent on the 16th day of November, 1857, by the Reverend Charles Thomas Poix in the Church of England at Richmond in the colony of Victoria. I was born in Newfoundland and am now 44 years of age. I am informed and verily believe that the respondent was born in Lancashire, England, and she is now 38 years of age. Before my marriage with the respondent, I was a miner and a storekeeper and lived in Kingower in the colony of Victoria, and since the said marriage, I have been a miner at Kingower. Before the said marriage, the respondent followed no occupation and had lived with her parents at Richmond in the colony of Victoria, and since that, until on or about the 1st of March 1858, she was supported by me, and since the last mentioned date, I have been informed and verily believe that she has been supported by George Thomas Preston, the respondent in this suit. There are no children of the said marriage living. I cohabited and lived with the said respondent as man and wife from the time of the marriage till about the 1st day of March 1858 at Kingower, when she left me and proceeded to Melbourne in the colony of Victoria on the pretence of seeing her brother. The respondent never returned to me. I am informed and verily believe that very soon after her arrival in Melbourne she went to live with the said George Thomas Preston, the co-respondent in this suit, a brickmaker living at South Yarra in the colony of Victoria, and she has lived with him ever since. I received a letter from the respondent shortly after she left asking for money to enable her to return to me, which I sent, and received a reply from her to the effect that she would never return to me. I am informed and verily believe that shortly after the respondent received the money in the last paragraph mentioned, she committed adultery with the said George Thomas Preston, the co-respondent in this suit, as at his house, South Yarra, and has since been living in adultery with him up to the present time and has had 6 children. I know nothing of the co-respondent, the said George Thomas Preston. The reason I've not taken the proceedings before now is that I have never had sufficient means to prosecute them. There is no collusion or conveyance, directed or indirect, past or present, between the respondent or anyone liable to be made with the respondent or the deponent. In March 1878, he was declared insolvent as the hotel keeper of Barrington's Hotel in Wilson Street, Horsham. It had been recorded that Isabella had handed the deeds of the land that her father had given them to Alpheaus, and he used that not long after they married to purchase the hotel. By the time he was insolvent, he was £584 in debt, and this was only 8 months after buying the hotel. Once bankrupt, he worked as a wool presser for 3 months near Ballarat and a station hand at Springbank Station at Mount Araples for 13 weeks until he was dismissed. The statement claims that he got drunk and he beat Isabella, and so he was dismissed immediately. And then by the time 1878 came about, he was back mining at Kingower. In July 1882, he was recorded as being hospitalised at Mount Gambier, South Australia, and he went by the name Albert John Montague when he was in South Australia. Again, that Montague name popping up in his identifications. There was an article that said he'd been brought to Mount Gambier from Beachport in South Australia. He was listed in 1883 as a lighterman at Beachport using the name Albert J. Montague. A lighterman is somebody that lightens, that is, unloads a ship and then transfers the cargo to another vessel or to the shore. The reason why it was featured in the newspaper was that Alpheaus was arrested on a charge of slander. Himself and 2 others, one being an employee at the hospital that he was in, plus another patient, claimed that the dispenser at the hospital had acted in a lewd manner towards them. They had gone to court and the charges were dropped. However, it was interesting that the men involved, they certainly were quite swiftly dealt with by the law. By January 1883, so 7 months later, he settled in Nil in Victoria, and he was referred to in the local paper as being engaged in the fishing industry for 3 years. So this is quite possibly what he was doing down in South Australia as well as being a lighterman. And he was reported to be the first to introduce fruit trees to the district, and he opened a fruit and fish shop for a few months as well. He was also noted as organising events for the Nil Athletics Club, which he did for the remainder of his life, and he was also on the Agricultural Society Committee. So once he came to Nil, he seemed to be very much part of the community. By 1885, he'd met Alice Ann Hardingham. She was from Horsham, but her uncle was a prominent person in Nil. They had a daughter, Ethel Kate Barrington, in Geelong in 1885. Alice was 23 at the time of her daughter's birth. Alpheaus was 53. Albert and Alice appear to have been happy together, although it must have been common knowledge in the town that their relationship had never been formalised, but they seemed to be respected and treated as husband and wife. Alice must have been a strong and remarkable young woman. Even from the scant information available, one gets the impression that she knew her man well, and she was more than able to hold her own in the relationship. The fact that Albert's drinking problems, which I'll give you more details on soon, seem to have disappeared by this time, and it probably owes a lot to her presence and influence. They had 4 children together, although only 2 reached maturity, and it seems that Albert tried to do the right thing by Alice, and in August 1886, that is after their daughter Kate had been born, he travelled to Adelaide and turned up on Isabella's doorstep asking for a divorce. Isabella, who had good reason to be resentful and spiteful, told him it was out of the question. However, this setback did not dissuade Alice from continuing the relationship with him. Albert, as he was known now, was a likeable character, and he played an active part in the community. He appears to have been regarded as quite an intellectual with knowledge of literature and the arts. And in light of the quality of the New Zealand Journal that I spoke to you about in the last episode, a literary interest comes as no surprise. He had a musical bent in the event that in July 1887, a group of local enthusiasts decided to form a brass band, and Albert was chosen as the leader. His shop developed into a pretty mixed business. It sold books, musical instruments, stationery, fancy goods, French perfume, tobacco, and sporting equipment, and it also employed men's and women's hairdressers within the shop. In the Nil Free Press, Barrington advertised a wide variety of instruments, including organs and pianos by best makers, accordions, cornets, violins, clarinets, and flutes. These advertisements are an eloquent testimony to his enthusiasm for music, but it do little to demonstrate his commercial good sense. The number of pianos and organs and clarinets and violins that were sold in the Nil district during the 1880s and 1890s surely was very small, as Nil was a very small town at the time. In November 1888, it was reported that his stationer's shop in Nil had burnt down alongside a number of other buildings. He rented the building and he did have some fire insurance, so he managed to get out of that a lot more lightly than what he did when he owned the pub in Horsham. It seems Alpheus still had links to Kingour in this time. He was in a newspaper, mentioned that he was on the Board of Trustees to plan a cemetery site at Kingour in January 1885, and he also applied for funds to prospect down shafts in 1891. In August 1893, he owned a tobacconist shop in Nil, and also in 1893, Isabella Powell Smith applied for a divorce. She obviously didn't know that her marriage was null and void because he had his prior marriage to Elizabeth Craven. So, of course, that was not to be uncovered. So I'll read to you now the particulars of the divorce between Isabella Barrington, the petitioner, and Albert John Barrington, the respondent, and Alice Hardingham, the co-respondent. You'll notice that Isabella also refers to Alpheus as Albert John. So it must seem that upon his return to Australia, he's gone from Alpheus, Alphonse in New Zealand, and now Albert John once he's returned. I, Isabella Barrington, formerly Smith of Horsham in the colony of Victoria, wife of the above, named Albert John Barrington of Nil, make the oath and say, I was on the 5th day of April 1875 lawfully married to Albert John Barrington, the above named respondent, by the Everard George Wilson Adams at the Presbyterian Church at Horsham. The said Albert John Barrington has, without cause or excuse, wilfully deserted me, and without such cause or excuse has left me continually so deserted during 3 years and upwards. The said Albert John Barrington has been guilty of adultery with Alice Hardingham, formerly of Horsham, now of Nil, spinster, coupled with circumstances and conduct of aggravation and of repeated acts of adultery, as hereinafter mentioned. I was born at Victoria Valley, near Mount Cole, in the said colony of Victoria, on the 20th day of May, 1885, and I am now 38 years of age, and I was then and am now domiciled in the colony of Victoria. The said Albert John Barrington was, I verily believe, born in Ireland in the year 1888, and is now 45 years of age, and he is then and now domiciled in the colony of Victoria. Prior to the date of the said marriage, I was living with my father, and since the said marriage, when I have not been living with my husband, I have been engaged as a domestic servant or laundress or cook or as a needlewoman. Albert John Barrington was, at the date of the marriage and for some time afterwards, a barman in a hotel in Horsham, and since the said marriage he has had different times been engaged as a hotel keeper on his own account, as a wool presser and a knockabout on stations, and, as I believe, has followed these occupations. There has been no issue of the said marriage, so in other words, no children. After being married with Albert John Barrington, we lived together as husband and wife in a cottage in Horsham belonging to my father, but for which my husband paid him no rent for about 3 years and 4 months. About 2 years and 6 months after the marriage, my husband began to acquire intemperate habits and to drink to excess, and by neglecting me at times and beating me. About 3 years and 4 months after the said marriage, the month of August 1878, my husband obtained the title deeds of the land on which the cottage in which we lived stood from my father, and obtained a loan on the security of that home of some £80, with the aid of which he started his business on his own account as a hotel keeper, and obtained a licence for the house, and then called it Barrington's Hotel in Wilson Street, Horsham. He carried on the said hotel for 8 months, assisting therein, and I lived there with him as husband and wife for about 8 months, when he filed his schedule for insolvency, where he gave up the business and left Horsham and went wool pressing, while I obtained employment in Horsham as a domestic servant. But 3 months later obtained a job as a domestic servant at Springbank Station near Mount Araples, where my husband was engaged as a station hand and knockabout. After I had been about 13 weeks at the station, my husband got drunk and beat me, and the manager of the station had to interfere, which led to him being discharged. The next morning he drew his own and the principal part of my wages, decamped and left me at the station, where I remained for 3 weeks. I then came to Horsham, where I found my husband drinking and without means, and after remaining with him for a week, I obtained employment in the Criterion Hotel, in that place as housemaid and laundress, while my husband remained for about 4 weeks in Horsham, drinking and knocking about frequently, annoying me and demanding money of me, and occasionally using violence to me. When he left the town, then went, I verily believe, to New South Wales. I remained at the Criterion Hotel for about 6 weeks, and then took employment at Mr. Thomas Pepys's Hotel, Jung, near Horsham, as a cook. When I had been there about 2 months, my husband returned from New South Wales and came to Jung, where he got me to give him money, and subsequently on 2 occasions in about the months of August and September 1829, refusing to give him more money, he threatened to shoot me, and fearing that he might carry out his threat, he left any situation at Mr. Pepys's Hotel. I went to reside with friends of mine, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas at Matoa, the farmer being a bullock driver. I resided with them until the month of March 1880, supporting myself entirely. On the first day of January 1880, my husband, having discovered where I was, came to Matoa, stayed there one night cohabiting with me, but in my refusing to promise to save up my money and give it all to him, he ended up leaving. He had broken up homes that we formerly had. He had abused and ill-treated me, threatened to shoot me, and to save myself, I had to run away and take refuge in a neighbour's house. My husband then left Matoa, where I continued to reside and support myself by taking on sewing, until July 1880, when I went to Adelaide in the province of South Australia and obtained employment there as a domestic servant. I did not see or communicate with my husband after going to Adelaide until the 10th day of August 1886, when he came to where I was in service in Adelaide, had an interview with me, and then he said that he was going to obtain a divorce from me. I replied that he could not do so, but that I believed that he was living in adultery with Alice Hardingham, which he denied, and then he left without me having cohabited with him as husband and wife. I did not again see my husband until the Easter holidays of 1889, when I visited Nil, where my husband was residing. I called at his shop in Nil, and where he was carrying on a business as a tobacconist. He refused to see me, but subsequently on the same day he saw me at a hotel, and at that place, in the presence of other persons, intimated that I intended to take divorce proceedings against him on the ground of his desertion and his adultery with Alice Hardingham. In the year 1885, I verily believe my husband began to cohabit with Alice Hardingham, then of Horsham, a spinster, and a child I verily believe was born to them at Geelong, and in the following year I verily believe died and was buried at Horsham on the 11th day of January 1889. Albert John Barrington, I believe, has continued to live with Alice Hardingham and cohabit with her as husband and wife ever since 1885 in Horsham, Geelong and Nil and other places. He is now living under the same roof and cohabiting with Alice Hardingham in Nil. Alice Hardingham has, since the year 1885, lived with him and cohabited with my husband and given birth to 4 children, which I verily believe my husband is the father. I have not cohabited with my husband since the month of January 1880, and I've received no support of any kind from him since about May 1880. I have not colluded with my husband or any other persons in instituting these proceedings for the divorce. So the marital issues seem to have started around the time that he divorced Elizabeth Craven. So the drinking and the mistreatment of Isabella seems to have happened then, because of course it was in the papers, and in those days when you had a divorce case it was detailed in newspapers for all of the public to see. So I think she would have realised at that point that she in fact was married to a man that was already married. From the time of his arrival in Nil, Albert had been aware that he suffered from a heart complaint. And on the 14th of November 1893, the Nil Free Press informed its readers that regretfully our townsperson, Mr. A.J. Barrington, was in a critical state of health. Although he managed to pull through the crisis, the end came soon. He died on the 15th of December, the very day that Isabella was awarded legal costs against him. So poor Isabella, she was unjustly treated to the very end. Even though she had the support of the law, she was unable to extract her wifely dues. Barrington's funeral, the newspaper reported, was attended by a large and representative gathering of townspeople and others, Mr. Barrington being an old resident and having many friends throughout the district. The newspaper said he was 45 years old. His death certificate that his brother, Alice's brother George, so his brother-in-law, filled out said he was 43. He was in fact 61. Even in his death, we certainly have an inconsistency with information with Barrington. Just to give you a little bit of information about his descendants. So after Barrington's death, Alice was left in a difficult situation. She had 2 children under the age of 5 to look after. She also had the demise of Barrington's ailing business that she had to deal with after he died. And 6 weeks after Barrington was buried, she was declared insolvent. She stated it was the pressure from creditors and sickness being identified as her cause of predicament. Her assets amounted to £65, however, her liabilities were £324. Eventually, Alice moved back to her hometown of Horsham, and in August 1896, she married William Lawrence, a gardener. They had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, and obviously bringing up the 2 surviving Barrington children as well. Alice died in 1941 in Horsham, and the 2 Barrington children that survived, Albert Barrington Jr., he inherited his father's love of music. He was an outstanding singer and whistler, and it's mentioned in family stories that he once performed for the king. I found him in 1910 in the census records as a billiard maker living at the old Haymarket Hotel in Maribyrnong, Victoria, when he was 22. He died in Sydney in 1924 at the age of 35. He did not marry. Barrington's other child with Alice was Nellie Barrington. She lived in Horsham and Ararat for most of her life. She died in Melbourne in 1976, aged 84, and Nell had one daughter, Yvonne. So out of all the children that he had with Elizabeth Craven, with Sarah Gee, and then with Alice, the only descendant from those children was Yvonne, and I have a record of her dying in 1988 in Lakes Entrance, Victoria. Now back to my great-great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Craven. So, as you are aware, her first marriage was to Alpheaus John Barrington, and as you would have heard from the divorce records between Alpheaus and Elizabeth, she married a man named George Thomas Preston, who is my great-great-great-grandfather. Now I'm going to uncover the reason why there's 2 marriage records. George Thomas Preston, as you heard, was a brickmaker from Prahran in Victoria. However, there is a surprise that comes between Alpheaus Barrington and George Thomas Preston. Once I went in and had a look at her parents' deaths online, I found a family gravestone, and a name popped up, Henrietta Sinberg. There's no Sinbergs in the family tree with the Prestons. I looked into all of the Preston children, and there was no Henrietta Sinberg, and I couldn't figure out why this was on the family grave. And when I endeavoured to locate her birth record, much to my surprise, it was actually Elizabeth's daughter. So Elizabeth Craven had given birth to Henrietta after leaving Alpheaus Barrington, but before she met George Thomas Preston. Elizabeth gave birth to Henrietta Sinberg on the 25th of September 1860 in Melbourne, 2 years after her son William James Barrington died. Her father was Henry Detlef Christian Sinberg, known as Harry Sinberg. He was a German, 6 years Elizabeth's senior, and he arrived in Sydney on the 15th of October 1867 via Hokitika in New Zealand. Little Henrietta died on the 22nd of November 1865. She was only 5 years old. And when Henrietta was nearly 4 years old, Elizabeth Craven married George Thomas Preston on the 25th of August 1864. So it was the first time they married. So George Thomas Preston, I must assume, helped take care of Henrietta with Elizabeth, or alternatively, Henrietta stayed with Elizabeth's parents, hence why she was buried with the other family members there. Now, as you know, there are 2 marriage certificates for Elizabeth George. So once Elizabeth was tracked down in November 1876 due to Alpheaus's intention to divorce, she then would have been shocked to realise that, first of all, Alpheaus appeared out of nowhere, and she would have known, I would assume, that he had gone overseas. And in the divorce records, it does mention that she was aware her husband had gone to the South Sea Islands, New Zealand and New South Wales. So she, I think, would have assumed that her husband was no longer alive and felt that it was safe to go ahead and marry George Thomas Preston. So, of course, once she had the divorce papers issued to her and the divorce then was finalised, Elizabeth and George very quickly, 3 weeks after the divorce, in fact, made it official by crossing the river and going to make sure that in Victoria they had their second marriage certificate certified in January 1878. And by this stage, they weren't living in Melbourne. They had moved up to Moama on the border of Victoria and New South Wales and were farming up there. They'd already had 6 children by the time Elizabeth divorced Alpheaus, and then they went on to have another 4 children. Henrietta's husband, George Preston, died on Christmas Day in 1892. The farm was sold in February 1894, and then Elizabeth took up land near Deniliquin. And Elizabeth died on the 13th of June 1904, aged 64 years. And she was known to be, quite a, she had a fair bit of land and did very well for herself by the end of her life. In my great-grandmother's recollections of her, she describes her as a very happy woman. Her son had bought land up near Deniliquin, hence her coming up and having land herself. So that is my story of my great-great-great-grandmother and uncovering the mystery of a very interesting and complicated man of many names, but for the purposes of most of my story, Alpheaus John Barrington. I hope you have enjoyed my story. Remember that if you have your own family tree that you would like to have more research on, I'm more than happy to help. Please see my Facebook page, Family History Mysteries. Or if you have uncovered a mystery or an exciting story that you would love shared on this podcast, I'd love to hear from you. I'll add the links to my research in connection with Barrington, in particular his New Zealand expedition, also a sketching that was made for the journal entry. And I'll also post a photo of Elizabeth and George Preston